Alrighty, next up in our series, we're going to talk about just a general overview of cell injury and death. So we're going to go over reversible versus irreversible cell injury, and we'll go over the basics of the two main types of cell death. So what are some things that can lead to this cell injury? So we talked about this a little bit in the previous video, but if a cell is stressed and it can no longer adapt, so we talked about the four main adaptations of cells, but if those adaptations fail, that can lead to cell injury. If cells are exposed to inherently damaging agents, that can lead to cell injury, or if they just have intrinsic abnormalities, that can lead to cell injury as well. So any of these things can lead to cell injury. But are these going to be reversible or irreversible? So remember, we have the two main types of cell injury, reversible and irreversible. Now, reversible injuries can, return, the cell can go back to homeostasis, but they can progress to irreversible injuries. Another thing that can happen is an injury can happen that is not reversible, and it can just be automatically irreversible. But either way, that can then lead to cell death. So if the stimulus either persists for long enough, so a reversible injury that persists for too long, or if it's a severe enough injury, those can lead to irreversible injuries, which lead to cell death. So reversible injury, this is typically in the early stages of cell injury, so again, it hasn't been progressive enough to become irreversible, or if it's just a mild injury. So at this point, the functional and the morphologic changes are reversible if that stimulus is removed. So whatever is hurting the cell or damaging the cell is removed, they can go back to normal. So what is going to happen? So one of the things that's going to happen is you're going to have reduced oxidative phosphorylation. So reminder, oxidative phosphorylation is how ATP is made, and that takes place in the mitochondria. So that's the major source of ATP in aerobic organisms. Now, you do also have other ways to make ATP, anaerobic ways, but they're not as efficient. And so first of all, you're going to have this reduced oxidative phosphorylation. That is going to then lead to a depletion of ATP. You are also going to have changes in the ion concentrations, and that's going to affect water influx into the cell. So if water is coming into the cell, that's going to cause the cells to swell. So these are considered to be the hallmarks of reversible cell injury. So I would definitely know these. Now, what happens if the injury becomes irreversible? Well, that means that the cell can't recover, which means that cell is going to die. So what can cause this? There are a lot of different things that can cause this, but there's three things that are just indisputable. These are definitely indisputably irreversible changes that would cause cell death. And the first one of these is going to be mitochondrial irreversibility. So if you kill the mitochondria, you're going to kill the cell. So the mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell, these are what are making your ATP. These, if they die, the cell dies. If the membrane can't keep sodium out, the cell is going to die. So at first, that membrane is going to become a little bit irregular. You're going to have some membrane blebs. But if that gets so bad that you're going to lose that ion gradient, then the sodium is going to come in. That's going to cause the cell to swell too much. That cell is going to die. So irreversible membrane defects. And then the third indisputable irreversible change is going to be if the lysosomes start to auto-digest that cell, the cell is going to die. So we talked about the two types of cell death. So you have apoptosis, which is your programmed cell death, and you have necrosis, which is your kind of abnormal or premature cell death. So apoptosis, again, is that programmed form of cell death. So what happens is the cell's DNA or proteins are damaged beyond repair. And so what happens is the cell is going to then kill itself, right? So if the DNA or the proteins are damaged so bad that they can't be repaired, that cell is then going to die. Now, there's three main things that are going to happen. So number one, you're going to have nuclear dissolution. And then you're going to have fragmenting of the cell. And importantly, you're not going to completely lose that membrane integrity. This is key here. So the cell is fragmenting, but the membrane is not, the membrane integrity is not completely lost. I would probably star that on here. And then you're also going to have rapid removal of that cellular debris. So this is important because all of this is very highly regulated. So because this is programmed cell death, this means it's highly regulated, and this is driven by a series of genetic pathways. And so because you're not completely losing that membrane integrity and the cellular debris is rapidly removed, you don't have inflammation. This is very important. Versus in necrosis, because this is unregulated cell death, it's going to be different. So you're going to have damage to the cell membrane, and what that is going to cause is loss of ion homeostasis. So if you don't have those transporters in the cell membrane, your ions are going to be out of whack. Another thing that's going to happen is the lysosomal enzymes can come into the cytoplasm and digest the cell, and then you're also going to have those cellular contents leaking out into the surrounding extracellular matrix and that tissue, and that's going to cause inflammation. That's one of the key differences between apoptosis and necrosis. So apoptosis, we said, was highly regulated, but what can actually cause necrosis? Well, there's a lot of different things, but here are 4 classic examples. So first, ischemia. If you're blocking blood flow and thus oxygen flow to a tissue or a cell, it's going to die. If you have some sort of trauma to a cell, it can die. If cells are exposed to various toxins, they can die. And if you have various infections, that can cause cell death as well. But like I said, there are other causes of necrosis as well. These are just 4 classic examples. So to compare the 2 types of cell death, we had apoptosis, which is that regulated cell death or programmed cell death, and then we have necrosis, which is the unregulated cell death. So apoptosis is classically called like a normal or a programmed cell death, versus necrosis is abnormal or pathologic. Now, apoptosis can be associated with cell injury, but it's not necessarily associated with cell injury, whereas necrosis is pretty much always associated with some form of cell injury. And then lastly, apoptosis is not going to have inflammation because you don't completely lose that membrane integrity, and the membrane fragments are going to be picked up really quickly, versus in necrosis, because it's not regulated, you're going to have a host response, you're going to have inflammation. So this picture is from your text. This is from Robbins, and we can kind of see what this is going to look like. So in a normal cell here, you're going to have, this is normal cell in homeostasis. Now, if you have some sort of injury, and it's at first, not too severe, it's just a mild injury, it's reversible, that some of the things you're going to see, you're going to have cellular swelling, you're going to have these membrane blebs, but the membrane is still overall intact, so all of this is still reversible. So this could reverse, and the cell could recover and go back to homeostasis. But if this is a progressive sort of injury, it can lead to necrosis. So here you can see that the membrane is no longer completely intact. You've lost that integrity of the membrane, and that's going to cause some of these cell contents to leak out, which can then cause inflammation in that tissue. You're also going to have breakdown of the organelles inside, and that can cause a lot of other problems. The lysosomes can come in. All of this is now leaking into that tissue. So all of that is unregulated and causes inflammation. Whereas in a apoptotic example over here, so we have the normal cell, and this is, initiated by the body. This is regulated. So at first, you're going to have chromatin condensing, and you're also going to have membrane blebs, just like you did in in reversible injury. But notice that it's not as severe, and it's all very regulated. Now, as these start to bleb off, what is going to happen is they're actually going to come off of the cell itself. So the cell is now fragmenting, and these are what we call apoptotic bodies. Now, notice the membrane itself is still intact. So these literally just like bleb off, and then they're picked up by phagocytes in the surrounding tissue. So all of these, even though it's all fragments, they're all intact fragments. Versus these fragments over here, it's literally just like pieces of the cell falling off, very unregulated, and these are actual like controlled apoptotic bodies. So you don't have cell contents leaking into the surrounding tissue, and each of these little blebs or apoptotic bodies are then going to be eaten up nicely and cleanly and quickly, so you don't have that inflammation. So that's the overview, and in the next lecture video, we're going to go over the various causes of cell injury.